You are listening to Wicked Psychotherapists, a podcast where two psychotherapists show you that taking care of and learning about mental health doesn't have to be wicked hard.
I'm Tanya Dos Santos.
And I'm Erin Gray.
And this is Wicked Psychotherapists, a podcast brought to you by two therapists who love to talk about and bring awareness to mental health topics in our pop culture.
And we hope to infuse a little bit of our experience and personalities to help broaden your noggin.
Today, we want to talk to you about, first, let's see what's in our cups, actually. Let's
start with you. I always start first. What do you have? What type of cup are you showing us today? Or those listening, they'll just have to use their imagination.
This is my Golden Girls cup. It's my trusty see-through one that says, live like Rose, dress like Blanche, think like Dorothy, and speak like Sophia. And that, I think, is my life motto. If you are a fan of the Golden Girls, you know what I'm talking about. But I just have almost gone decaf coffee with some foam on top. What's in your cup?
Oh, just very fancy Publix grocery store tea, black tea.
Nice.
And just in a
like
plain, like a little orange flowered mug.
Ooh.
With a little bit of milk, no sugar.
Very nice.
Just doing it very Irish.
Simple. Keeping it Irish. Yeah.
All right. I guess I'd put whiskey in it, right? If I was,
oh yeah, that's true.
But my grandmother used to always just make me tea with milk in it.
That's nice. That's a very comforting drink. I like that. Very nice. Let's jump into today's topic. We are talking about trends that we're noticing out in the social media sphere in mental health and some of maybe the good in that with bringing awareness and maybe some of the downsides to that we're seeing. Not trying to be too Debbie Downerish about it, but maybe just saying, as professionals in the field, kind of what we're noticing from that, right? We kind of started out talking about, you had noticed that there's a trend with people thinking that they maybe had ADHD or had a diagnosis of ADHD, kind of signs of that's been brought up a little more lately. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I've noticed sometimes Tanya and I like to see what are some of the trends. Like, what are we hearing from our clients, or what are we seeing on Instagram or the reels, or what is happening. And it seems like this week or recently it's been a lot of, do I have ADD or do I have ADHD? Because perhaps they're showing that they're inattentive, or they're having difficulty continuing or starting a task, or they get distracted or bored at meetings, or just a lot of inattention at school. So there are some TikToks, videos, or things on Instagram where people are like, well, if you show any of these signs, then you too have ADD or ADHD. Yeah. So I have gotten that several times. When I say several, it's not just one or two. It's a bunch. And it's adults, which adults, we can find out we have diagnoses of things that we haven't had in the past because maybe our work is slipping, or maybe there's been our own self-diagnosis or self-reports. We're like, hey, maybe I need to get this checked out. But I just thought it was a lot. So I was like, hey, Tanya, have you noticed this?
Yeah. And I had not been experiencing the same trend. I had seen some other stuff that we'll talk about, but we did get to talking about that. Some people can present, it's great that they're wanting to maybe take a look at themselves and want to come to therapy. We're never against people reaching out. I think part of the good part of that is the awareness. It starts the discussion. It gets that going with people talking about what could be bothering them. Is this something that's maybe typical, or is it atypical? The issue that I can see with that in watching some of these reels and watching some of the TikToks is that some of these symptoms are very broadened to the point where it's almost like looking on WebMD if you're sick, where it might apply to you no matter what, right? And that can be problematic, thinking that, okay, well, if I have these, then, and I have noticed, I'm not trying to put down these reels that do try to raise awareness or talk about these issues, that some people do put in a disclaimer where they'll say this is not a diagnostic tool. Some of them do not. For people that don't necessarily understand what this means, they may be alerted. They may be kind of scared, like, oh, this must mean something, a diagnosis is something scary. So I have to get this checked out. And then possibly misinformation gets passed along because some people are not, they may be knowledgeable in this area. They may not be. We don't really know their credentials. We don't know their backgrounds. We don't know what they work with. And we can read something online, sure. But when you don't work within the field and you don't necessarily understand the context of these symptoms and working through a diagnosis and how to get a diagnosis, that could be problematic for people and thinking that they maybe have something wrong, where it may just be typical of people that we're not 100% focused in our lives, right? Being distracted sometimes is a part of life. It only becomes a problem when it's a problem and it really starts to take away from your quality of life. Like you're not able to work. You're missing days at work because you're not able to get yourself together. You can't organize things. Your functioning at work is falling. You're functioning at home with your family, with your friends. You're not able to organize things so that you can socialize, and you're maybe isolating based on so many different factors where it could be very problematic. And also, you had mentioned it could be something else, right? It's not necessarily ADHD.
So often people just want to go straight to the diagnosis of something, whether it's I have ADHD. But yeah, a lot of people who describe that they may have ADHD or ADD, they could just be in different situations or different circumstances. It could be like one of those things like, wow, maybe I'm just really didn't have a restless sleep, so I'm bored at work, or I can't focus, or I had too much coffee today. Or you always have to rule out medical before you get a diagnosis for anything. And that's so important to make sure your lab work is up to date, all your medical. And if you were to, like with ADD and ADHD, that has to be diagnosed by someone who is able to do the testing and to read the testing as well.
And that's usually a neuropsychologist, right?
Right.
That's pretty much not what we do. We do not have those credentials to do that. So we would usually refer out and say, get that testing. Let's get some more clarity on this to see what the issues are.
I know some people are hesitant because like, oh, well, can I just tell my doctor this is what I have? But they could. But I think people who are hesitant, most places, you will have to maybe call around a little bit, but your insurance will cover. And it's usually about like 4 hours. Some places you'll go back 4 times. Sometimes they'll do it in 2-hour blocks or something like that. I think if you're really wanting to know, it's worth it to get it done by somebody, to get the testing done instead of saying, hey, I have this diagnosis.
I do have to say, not all insurances cover the testing.
Right. Not all, but there are.
It's worth it.
I'm finding that there are some that do. Of course, just like with anything, there's more that don't, but it's worth it to call around.
And to check in and to see if there's like a sliding scale, or, sometimes people will work with you, sometimes they won't. I think that could be a barrier to some people getting an official diagnosis, but that is how you officially would get a diagnosis. Is that how everyone has gotten a diagnosis? No, I don't think so. Or has been able to maybe get treatment like medication for ADHD? No. It really could be that, like you said, somebody could go and say, I have these symptoms, and maybe I'm not sure if the doctor might say, well, this kind of sounds like it. Maybe the doctor feels that they know this person well enough. Maybe that is something in terms of saying, hey, there is a diagnosis here. Then you get medication, and then they come to a therapist and say, oh, well, I have medication for this. A therapist may be like, well, that sounds like they are working with someone on this. Somebody had to evaluate this. So there can be some of those snags there. There's also the mental health system and our health system are not perfect in that regard. As people know, we're not trying to put it down, but there are some gaps in there in how this may get carried over in your diagnosis. There's not really an official place where there's like a bank of like official diagnoses, right? You have to request that paperwork. A lot of this is self-reported. Like we said, sometimes it could be done differently than outside of a neuropsychologist. Maybe the doctor, and we're talking like a primary care physician, something like that, does feel like, okay, I can add this on to the medical record. I do feel comfortable with that. Although I am finding a downward trend of that lately when diagnosing, especially, I would say, adolescents and children. They tend to refer out.
What other trends have you seen?
So I know we were talking about this before, but I have had some people come in and talk about attachment style. Attachment style in people saying, well, I have anxious attachment, I have avoidant attachment, or, my parent has this, my sibling, my friend has this. And it's a very loosely used term. And I do hear it being misused. And it's something that, again, I'm not trying to say this is not a bad thing because you're bringing this up to your therapist. It promotes a conversation, right? But just to know that sometimes the way it's being used out colloquially is not necessarily therapeutically how we use it. There's a difference. And just for example, and I'm not going to, obviously I'm not going to bring in anything that was said from any sessions, but say somebody comes in and says, my dad has an anxious attachment style. And you kind of want to explore, as therapists would say, well, what do you mean by that? What are you seeing? He gets really anxious. He gets anxious a lot. So his attachment style is anxious. It's kind of just saying like the characteristic of being anxious, that's their attachment style.
So
Well, that's not the case, right?
Yeah. So, and then the reframe would be, you're nuts. No, just kidding. No, the reframe would be,
I didn't expect that. Okay.
No, just kidding. But your dad might have a little bit of anxiety, or maybe he's anxious in different situations.
Right.
Just because someone exhibits something, that might not be their style. So that's not how they perform or how they relate to every single person in every situation.
Absolutely. Right. And it may not, attachment style traditionally is, how we refer to it reflects how you first bonded with your primary caregiver in your life.
Mhm.
And that reflects the
Yep.
rest of your interactions with, right? People crave a healthy attachment to people in their primary years, and that can influence the rest of
Yeah.
their lives and their interactions with that. Do they always get it? No. I would say probably a majority of us, and maybe this is just because we have the therapy lens and we
Mhm.
meet people, like my primary interactions are with people that are seeking help, right? And
Right.
so my lens may be very different in terms of,
Mhm.
I feel like a lot of people have something in their attachment style that it's good to learn about and to say, okay, dad may be anxious, but that may not reflect, and there may be a kernel of truth in there,
Yeah.
right? Because there may be something suspected where, this brings up a lot of anxiety for dad. Dad tends to get really nervous. Dad gets like sick when he has to go in and go out with a group of friends kind of thing, or,
Mhm.
talk about his emotions kind of thing. He gets really, really nervous, and kind of seeing those different patterns in life. It's not just being anxious, right?
Yeah.
It's deeper than that.
Yeah. In that example, the person, you'd probably want to explore it more if the father was the patient or your client. So you might be like, okay, so maybe it's not just anxious attachment style. Maybe that's when you'd probably dive deeper and say, what else could be going on? Has this been going on for more than 6 weeks or more than 6 months?
Yeah. And in that case, if the client's saying like my dad, like what is it about your dad that like the anxiety, what does that promote in you? How does that make you feel like, he's not very present? Does that make you feel like, you
Mhm.
don't have a good relationship? And, is that kind of part of the feelings of, maybe depression or anxiety at home because there's not that cohesiveness, there's not that good connection and positive relationship with your dad? Does that play into something? In some cases, some people just bring it up and they just say it and they're just trying to explain to you and give an explanation and give you a bigger or a better picture of their family. And I think in that way, it's trying to kind of delve deeper and kind of
Yeah.
be speaking the language
Mhm.
that we're
Yeah.
speaking. That's not a bad thing, but there might
So
be
you-
some issues to it, right?
Yeah, because I have heard where people use, I think I have avoidant attachment or I have anxious attachment or this. And then when you hear, it's like, sometimes the context is right. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just, I'm a therapist, but think, I don't think I've ever described my attachment style to anybody. I mean,
Yeah, me neither. Other than the example I just used, like
Yeah.
for like, oh, I'm anxious, like, kind of that thing. But
Yeah, I don't know what I would describe mine. Maybe it's because we're in the field, which is like, all right, so I don't know. I don't think I'd go to a party and be like, so I'm avoidant personality. Just
Which one are
no,
you?
I don't have
The
avoidant
zodiac
personality
sign.
disorder. Oh, goodness, no, but
Yeah,
yeah,
like
yeah. What's your sign? It's like, oh
what's your
yeah,
sign? What's your attachment style?
yeah. What's your attachment style?
Which actually, you know what? At a party, now that I'm thinking about it, an attachment style might be more helpful than a zodiac sign. You know what I mean? That actually is kind of interesting.
Yeah,
If
that could
used correctly, right?
well, and it could be fun, I guess. okay, we're giving you guys little icebreakers then. So instead of just like, oh gosh, I'm at this party, how boring, or I have to talk to these people. Well, I guess you could tell that I'm more anxious. I don't really like talking to a lot of people unless I've had a drink or two. So unless it's people I know. I mean, like if it's people I know, yes, I like to talk. I'd be like, hey, what's your personality style?
Yeah, like yeah, I mean it is a deeper dive, and I think, the younger generation are discussing it more. It is more out in the open. I think
Mhm.
we're just addressing that it can sometimes be misused. There might be
Mhm.
required, and of course we can do that in therapy, right? We can turn
Right.
that right around and kind of say like, hey, it's actually kind of this, that psychoeducation portion, which is totally fine. But just to, I guess, be weary of looking at some of these reels and thinking, oh my God, I have this, and getting yourself anxious and thinking, I have
Yeah.
this, or going off of that, right? Because it's not therapeutically, that's not a good way to diagnose yourself. It might be a good way to kind of start looking at some areas of yourself and saying, maybe I should talk to someone, or maybe this is a problem. But
Mhm.
just because you match up with something or you can kind of relate to something, you have to know that there's a trend in a lot of these
Mhm.
things being very generalized, right?
Right. So I remember when we were in school, when we were taking abnormal psych and pharmacology. So those were two classes that we were warned beforehand. You
Yes.
may feel like you have everything and you're going to be very hesitant to take these medications or, or start wanting to diagnose everybody. It's very,
Or like worrying that like you're surrounded by psychopaths, or, kind of because you see like this one trait maybe a lot of people have, and
so, and that's what I feel like when I see the reels or the TikTok videos, and it reminds me of that, oh, so now they have this information. What are they going to do to it? It's very much like, oh, well, I have these, I'm anxious or I'm feeling a little sad or I'm afraid to be in crowds or I get distracted
exactly.
in meetings. This person does too. Or wait, they're describing everything that I've felt that I didn't have a name for.
Exactly. Yeah. And to give an example, like I've done this myself as a therapist. I've done this. I've fallen into that trap, and I had to double take. I had to question myself, and kind of be like, wait a minute, why am I feeling like this? And then I'm like, I think this is a very generalized way of looking at things, because there's this one, I'm not going to name it, but there's someone who on Facebook who has like a huge following, and it's revolves around ADHD symptoms. And I think they are excellent. I think they can be hilarious. And I think they can give some information to some people just to kind of see like what it's like. Like they're mainly posting memes about like this is what it's like being a person with ADHD, right?
Okay.
And that can promote that sense of, oh, you do that too. You do that, which is totally, I think that's a wonderful thing. That like, connection there. There has also been some times where I've seen memes where it will be like, do you ever realize that you actually have ADHD when you do this and that and that and that and that? And it'll list off some symptoms that are, I started to kind of see those over and over again. And I was like, do I have ADHD? And I do not think I have ADHD, but I was like, I do get unfocused. I do rewatch shows a lot of the same
Mhm.
time. I do for comfort. For me, that's my anxiety. And I think it's the way a lot of people comfort themselves.
Yeah.
It does not necessarily relate to ADHD. So I had to kind of walk myself out of that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, like, how often have people rewatch shows because you know what's going to happen, whether it's good or bad? Or, I mean, how often do you see like Seinfeld or Big Bang Theory or something? Where you're like, all right, I've already seen this 5,000 times. I'll watch it again.
Daily.
Or,
Yeah. Daily. It literally is on daily. Some people can attest to that.
but yeah, but I think that doesn't mean you have ADHD because you can watch it again. Or I watch shows sometimes late at night and I'm like zoning out or starting to fall asleep. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I just missed like half an hour of that. I'm going to have to rewind it or whatever.
I will rewatch shows as a background to doing my notes. Like I actually
Hmm.
have to have that on. Like I won't put on music most of the time. Like in fact, pretty much never. That's not a time when I listen to music, because music, I get into it and I like can't really concentrate. I will put on shows that I've watched over and over again because I already know what happens and I don't
Yeah.
have to pay that much close attention. And it's a comfort to have those people there that I know, I know.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think that this person was trying to be like, oh, this is a diagnostic tool. I don't think that at
Right.
all. I think they were really just trying to make a connection there that some neurodivergent people may do that, as a
Mhm.
means, and they very well could. There's also other people who may just be anxious. There's also people who may just they find comfort in it. That's how they unwind from
Yeah.
watching a familiar show.
And also, some people might been raised with everything on at once. So, oh my gosh, was the TV ever off at my house growing up? So now I'm the opposite. I like sometimes if I'm home alone, I'm like, nothing is on because it's nice because I don't have to watch Seinfeld. We're in a world, there's so much stimulation all the time.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, there's a transition to that from when we were younger where something may be on in the background, but it's like it's hard to get away from something. I mean, our refrigerators have smart TVs on them. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
You can see stuff through your refrigerator.
Yeah, it's creepy.
You really can't get away from it. And I know I
Mhm.
sound like, I know we're both saying this, but I sound like an oldie, kind of saying this. And I'm proud of it because I love my Golden Girls. It really is, it can be too much. And I think people saying, I feel like I can't focus, I feel like this is really tough. If you start to ask questions about the environment and how they grew up, when you grew up, was the TV on? When you studied, did you always need to have music on? Did you always need to have the TV and music on kind of thing? How does your brain process? How does your brain function? Sometimes things are, again, they're not a problem unless they're a problem. And sometimes I'll have clients coming to therapy and they're saying, I need better organization. I feel like I'm not achieving these goals that I have. I don't know what's going wrong, and that could be that exploration of that where possibly we're looking at, okay, what's gone awry? Did you ever have a good organization system? Are you able to? Is your environment
Mhm.
set up for that? Or is there something that maybe in your processing that is really inhibiting that?
Yeah.
And that maybe there are some executive function issues. Maybe
Or
there
were
is
they
some
never
stuff going
taught it?
on.
Because sometimes even in high school or college or your first real office job or whatever that might look like, you might be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm struggling. I'm getting written up or I'm getting these bad grades all of a sudden. This has never happened to me." Or because maybe they never were taught, hey, you can't just wait to the last minute to do something. You have to set up, have skills and set up or different methods of how to do things. And those could be things that could be taught, or not everybody has that ability just to know, oh, well, I'm supposed to take notes or I'm supposed
Yeah.
to go to bed early because I have work the next day. Or if I have a project or a report due on this day, that means I should be starting it a few weeks before it's due.
Right. And that kind of comes up with learning and routines are learned, right? And if you don't necessarily like, I know that personally, I got a lot of that from my teachers from school, from paying attention in school because I wanted to do well. And so I did pay attention to, okay, the teachers, and they probably still are screaming about, we have a book report due in 2 weeks. If you haven't started it, get on it. And those types of things. And people, kind of thinking like, "Oh, well, I did it last time, right? So I don't really have to do that. I can just ignore that." And recognizing the importance of that may be part of the problem because it's not necessarily enforced at home, right? You don't just learn everything from school. I think I learned a lot of things at school, but I really wanted to. I was a different kind of nerd in that way. People don't necessarily want that and they just kind of are, maybe get that more from home and the support from home, and if that's not really set up there or if it's maybe not known even at home or if there's not time for that, there's so many different factors. And that really can be worked out in therapy. And again, we're not saying that these videos and these reels and these TikToks don't have a value in opening this discussion. It shouldn't have to feel shameful. All these things, people shouldn't have to sit there and say, why can't I study? And this person next to me makes it look so easy, and kind of noticing.
And the videos and everything's definitely have merit. They just because we're having this conversation right now.
Right.
But also, I mean, I know I've had conversation with my clients because of it. The things that concern me is that people are listening to it and taking it as 100 this is me because I heard them and this person knows what they're talking about because they have a million followers. Let's pause and try to think of what else could be happening. And maybe you do have whatever it is that they're saying, but maybe you don't. Maybe it's something else or maybe it's
Right.
nothing.
And maybe it's just a matter of coming to your therapist or being able to learn through psychoeducation or being able to research what is it that I need to take a hold of? What is it that I need to start looking at and saying, or is there something that it's I don't even know where to start or I don't feel like I can do that? There's differences that again in therapy we would try to work through. And to note that we don't, therapists don't want to give you a diagnosis. I think we discussed this. We have to if you have insurance. You have to like have one on the first session. You have to have a diagnosis. We do not want to give that. It's something that is very much required in that regard. And that's why sometimes it may not even be discussed because we're just trying to work with what's hindering you, not necessarily with seeing you as, the ADHD or, kind of thing.
And that's it too. Like a lot of times people will be like, oh, I have ADD or I'm ADHD. It's like, yeah, you're not, and we say this, it sounds so cliche, but you're not whatever disorder or symptom that you have.
Right, yeah, and I know some people kinda do it as a friendly way of being like, "Oh, I might be forgetful. I might be, like or, I might get a little upset if you, reorganize this or if this thing isn't clean. I'm so, it might be kind of that type of thing." But again, it's kind of walking it back to, we're in that realm where we're actually doing those diagnoses. And for the most part, like we may not do ADHD diagnoses, that's through a neuropsychologist, but we're having to look at all these symptoms and to say, okay, where can we find some ways of improving that? Not looking for issues because it's up on this reel saying, like, oh, you might have this, you might have that. If you hadn't have seen that, was there a problem before? Or did it spark something that you're like, hey, wait, that is an issue? Like there's a difference between them. Because, like you said, having a lot of followers and a lot of popularity in there can sometimes be mistaken with this is truth, right? And it's not necessarily true.
And sometimes those hearing that for the first time of, oh, this person has something that's very similar to what I have, or this is making me have that conversation, or I want to get that tested, or I have more questions. That is a good thing. It is. As a young adult or teen, I wish I had something like that instead of just my Psych 101 in high school. I remember reading that for the first time, being like, oh, okay. I remember being a very anxious person growing. I know, hard to believe. But I remember like just being like, oh, this sounds familiar. But that's all I had was like a big old high school psychology book for my first thing.
Yeah, that was probably our first. I mean, it's not a TikTok reel because it really there are experts that are contributing to that, right? That is a little bit of a difference, but it is that first point of awareness, which is important. And I think that's what you're saying was that it is important to have that awareness and that, we'd rather that, but we're just kind of pulling it back a little bit and just saying, hey, let's look at it from a different lens, a critical lens at certain junctures. And it sounds like we're going back and forth on these videos, but that's the complexity of this issue is that there are some good points and then there are some maybe not so good points or just points to consider.
I watch some, I'm like, that's actually kind of interesting, or that person's right on point, or what a jerk. No, but there are some that you just wonder, like, where did they even get this information? But there are some that you're like, that's really valuable.
Yeah.
I don't know. Some of them you have to search. Just like with anything, you want to be like, where am I getting this information from? And who
exactly.
am I getting it from?
And I think that might be the resources of things may be a little bit looser than in our day, right? Like we had to get encyclopedia references for papers. We had to get if you had a website, it had to be accredited like in a certain way, kind of thing. Like, and that was just in college and grad school for me. That was a new thing. And now I feel like, and that's for writing a paper, as opposed to someone putting out a video of things. I mean, there's no real regulation of that other than if you're giving certain tips and saying, go do this, go do that could adversely affect someone and then they could get sued, right? That kind of thing. But there's not any regulation as to who sees that in the meantime. And certainly, and I know this is kind of ironic, right? Because we're saying that, right? But we are both licensed therapists. We are professionals in that regards.
And we're not telling them that they have a diagnosis or not. We're just saying rule out medical, get tested if you feel like you need to. Don't follow everything you see. He just always like, everything you see on TV isn't real, but everything you see on the reels or anything else, it's not everything is the truth.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there can be grains of truth in there, right? There can be generalizations. I guess bottom line is to know yourself and to kind of know if something is really kind of bothering you and you see it really impacting you and this real kind of, really affected you and it might be causing a problem and shed some light on that, it might be worth exploring,
Mhm.
but in a way that is a professional or from a very informed perspective.
Yeah.
Because again, you probably don't even know half of the people that you're watching on TikTok. I know that's for me, like I don't necessarily know their backgrounds. But
Mhm.
I do have that lens of let me take that into account. I have to kind of pull it back from there. And so we just want you to have that as well, just to kind of, from two therapists. So we talked about a couple of things. I know we could go on about some misused phrases and we'll probably have to do that in the future, kind of things like that, things
That'd
that
be
get
fun. Like we
too
could have like a
overused.
list of if you say this, you mean this. Or
Yeah, kind of like this is the actual definition. This is how it's getting used out there, and
yeah.
people are diagnosing their mom and their sister, and or saying that their mom and
Yeah.
sister do this and their friend does this when
Mhm.
actually they're just kind of being kind of a jerk,
Yeah.
And
Yeah, not
um,
everyone has to have a diagnosis either. Like, yeah, some people are just jerks.
yeah, and not everybody is gaslighting you because it's something that you're not necessarily wanting to hear or maybe a little bit inaccurate. There's some intention with gaslighting.
Right.
Anyways, okay, that's a different
Yeah.
topic.
That's our next one or something.
We hope you have a good week or two or month whenever we see you next. But
Hopefully it's sooner than a month.